Hi there, students. I'm XS. That's little x, little s, which stands for extra sweet, because that's what I am. I'm a puppy-sensei and I make Japanese content to help you level up your abilities. Often in my grammar drops, we discuss conjugations or verb forms, things that are helpful for you as you're adding to your set of knowledge with regard to building larger sentences in Japanese. But for today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Today, I'll be talking to you about the way books are divided up in Japanese. Why are we spending a whole grammar drop talking about the way books are divided? Well, I think it's sometimes helpful to approach grammar from the perspective of understanding why language works the way it does. We might think of it as the sociolinguistic framework, the way that the language affects culture and the way culture affects language, and vice versa, right? Okay, so when you think about how I spend my free time, you might imagine me sitting in a chair, reading a book on grammar by a fireplace, blowing bubbles from one of those little fake bubble pipes and saying, interesting. And you wouldn't be wrong. That's kind of my ideal life. But reading about grammar from a book rarely helps you understand the cultural impact that language is actually having on speakers of that language, not to mention the cultural impact of that language cross-culturally. So today, I'm going to speak from a very cultural level. It'll be very different from what I usually do, and that's okay. If you've ever been to a Japanese bookstore, if, for instance, you're lucky enough to live in a city that has a book off, then maybe you've seen something like this before. These little kanji are sometimes seen on the spines of books, or also sometimes on the cover, and they indicate that the book is only part of a larger story. The one on the right is kami, or ue, and that's the kanji meaning up. That always indicates that this is the first part of the story. Shimo, or shita, is the kanji meaning down, and that's the one all the way on the left. That indicates that this is the last part of the story. Sometimes books are broken up like this, with the top part of the book indicating part 1 and the bottom part of the book indicating part 2. And if the book happens to be broken up into 3 parts, then we're going to see naka or chu used for the middle of the story, and that's the kanji that we see in the middle there. If there are any more volumes than that, then it's usually going to be numbered, or it may even use Roman numerals. Okay, so let's talk about a few interesting cultural facts regarding the use of this up, middle, down numbering system for books. The first thing that you need to know is that this system does not indicate different books in a series. If there's a sequel, it will be a sequel, right? So this up, middle, down numbering system is only for one book that might be a book within a series. It's one story, but it just happens to be broken up into multiple actual physical books. We'll talk about why that is in a second, but for now, let's take a look at an example, okay? So what are we actually seeing here? These images are from a 7-book set of the Lord of the Rings series, in Japanese, Yubi wa Monogatari. The 2 blue images are from Tabi no Nakama, the Fellowship of the Ring. But notice how they're labeled. They are books 1 of 7 and 2 of 7, right? If you look to the right of the Yubi wa Monogatari title, right, the Lord of the Rings title, we see 1 and 2, indicating that this is book 1 and 2. But if you look to the right of the Tabi no Nakama, the Fellowship of the Ring title, we see ue and shita, right? Or kami and shimo. We see up and down, right? Why is that? That's because the Fellowship of the Ring story has been broken up into 2 different physical books. So these up and down labels are indicating that the one full complete story has been split up and spread out over 2 different physical books. Okay then, the red books make up the story of Futatsu no To, the 2 towers. And this is the same, right? It's the same way it's been divided into an upper part and a lower part. Do you see what I'm getting at? There are 7 books overall. They're numbered 1 through 7, And the first two physical books are actually one story. They make up the Fellowship of the Ring, but they've been divided up into two parts. And likewise, we see the same thing with the Two Towers books, and we see it again with O no Kikan, the Return of the King, right? And finally, we also have Tsuihohen, which are the appendices, and they don't have an up or a down label because nobody reads them. I mean because it's all contained within the same book. Now, obviously, there are economic reasons why books can sometimes get broken down this way. Obviously, the publisher just makes more money, right? That's fine. I'm not going to get into the ethics of that. But the interesting cultural note here is that one of the reasons that books often get broken down into these smaller segments is for ease of carrying. If you travel much in Japan, you're almost certainly going to spend time on a public transportation of some kind. Having a car is an absolute necessity in America because infrastructure bad, but in Japan it's so much easier to just hop on a train or a bus or a subway and you get where you're going pretty easily. If you step on a train in Japan, I can virtually guarantee you that you're going to see someone reading a book or a manga. We've talked about this before, but literature is super important in Japan. So much so that there are more authors on Japanese money than there are heroic national figures like the politicians that we plaster on our dollar bills. Well, with that in mind, having smaller, easily transportable books is really handy since you don't want to lug around a huge tome with you while you're on your train, right? That's very inconvenient. But if you break this big book down into a smaller part, it's a lot easier to slip that book into your laptop carrier or whatever that you're bringing with you to work or school or whatever. But wait, Puppy-sensei, haven't you told us many times that Japanese text takes up less space on the page when compared to English? So why do we need to split a book like Fellowship of the Ring into two books when in Japanese we know that the Japanese language is more space efficient than it is in English? Aren't Japanese books just naturally smaller? Well, yes and no. This is absolutely something that I think about a lot as a translator, and so I think it's actually really great to talk about this. Let's do some actual comparisons, alright? So, on the small scale, if we were just comparing titles, O no Kikan, ne, it takes up about half the space on the page compared to Return of the King, right? We can see that Return of the King just takes up a lot more space than the Japanese does. Okay, cool. That's good. That's exactly what we expected. Japanese is about twice as space efficient when compared to English. Next, let's look at the level of the sentence and see if we see the same thing that we saw at the level of the title. So here is the first sentence of The Fellowship of the Ring. The English reads, "This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history." Okay, great. What about the Japanese? The Japanese reads, この本は衆としてホビットのことを語っている。これを読みなれば、ホビットの特質があらかた納得されるし、またその歴史も多少お分かりになることと思う。Uh-oh. Well, that's not exactly what we expected, is it? At the same font size, the Japanese here actually takes up more space than the English. And really, the meaning really is pretty close when you compare the Japanese and the English. So why is the Japanese actually taking up more space on the page than the English is? Well, two reasons. In practice, while kanji tend to take up less space compared to English words, hiragana and katakana can occasionally take up more space when compared with English words. So it's just not always going to be the case that Japanese will take up less page space, especially when you consider it over a large amount of text, right? When you're thinking about the space of a novel, sometimes it just kind of comes out in the wash that the Japanese and the English will end up being about the same length of time, right? About the same length of page space. And that's not even the whole problem, Because the other aspect that we have to consider is the way that Japanese is actually laid out on the page when it's presented in a literary style. See, it's important to remember that the layout of a page in Japanese is very aesthetically different from the layout of an English page. As we know, Japanese writing starts at the top right of the page and then moves down and then to the left. That means that line breaks can actually eat up a whole lot of page space, so things like dialogue segments can end up causing quite a lot of empty space on the page. In the end, even though Japanese seems to take up less space at the level of the word, what we actually see is that Japanese text and English text can vary widely in exactly how many pages it's going to require to tell the same story. And that's why books like Lord of the Rings are really going to benefit from those smaller book publication styles. Alright, so what I've tried to do for you so far is just to help you understand why Japanese books often get chopped into 2 or even 3 parts, even though they actually might belong to a larger series. But let's talk about what that up, middle, and down kanji are actually doing when we use them to divide up books in this way. So, we can see those 3 kanji here. We've got kami, or ue, which means upper, top, above. And then we have naka, or chu, or uchi, which means middle, between, something like that. And then finally we have this shimo, or shita, which means bottom, below, under. Please note, I've given you a very abbreviated list of the meanings and the pronunciations for these words. I'm only providing you with the most relevant information for this specific lesson. Alright, my final point here. Why? Why do we use upper, middle, and lower as a way to break up stories in this way? Well, it's because in older times, all Japanese writing was done on scrolls. The upper part of the scroll was at the top, and so that's where the story started. And then you would read down from the top of the scroll. So as you added more scrolls to the story, you would ultimately need an upper scroll, the kami no bubun, the top part. And then you might have another scroll in the middle, the naka no bubun, the middle part. And finally, the last scroll would be the shima no bubun, the bottom part. The story ended at the bottom of the scroll. And we see that culturally maintained as a vestige in the way that Japanese books are published today. As I said, that's done mostly because 1. It makes books easier to carry around as you travel on things like public transportation. 2. It makes more money for the publisher. Me money. And 3. Book look nice on shelf, go pretty color, yay. I actually really enjoy this kami, naka, shimo system that still exists, and I feel like it's kind of a cool little bit of history that's stuck around, and we get to see it in play in modern Japanese society. I think that's really neat. I hope you do too. Next week, I want to go into more detail about the ways that we use naka, that word for middle, in some really interesting grammatical processes. So please look forward to that. Until then, また来週